And even if your agency will not allow for SOTs, you're never going to get accredited, they're never going to support any kind of certification for you, any of those things, you still usually can control documentation. You can control how much you document in a case.
Hey there, my name's Ashley Church.
And I'm Erin West.
We were once newly promoted crime scene and latent print supervisors on mutual struggle buses as we both simultaneously tried to navigate through the challenges within our forensic units.
Now we run a business where we create tools and resources that we wish we had had to make these transitions easier. We like to talk about the experiences we've had in the forensic field, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in the hopes to create awareness around these issues and move the needle forward to create positive change in the forensic community.
So if you're a forensic professional, regardless of your years of experience, who's not afraid to dive into real, raw, and sometimes uncomfortable topics, you're in the right place.
This is the Forensics Unfiltered podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of Forensics Unfiltered. We are excited to bring you part 2 of our interview with Glenn and Eric from the DOUBLELOOP podcast. If you haven't done so already, just go back one episode and make sure to catch part 1 of this 2-part series. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Without further ado, here is part 2 of Rethinking Training Methods. Before we start this episode, our guests would like to share a disclaimer that the opinions shared are their own and not representative of their current or past employment. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Yeah, so let's go to Matt's question here. This is a really good question, and I think that a lot of agencies have this struggle. So he said, if you don't have SOPs, do you go about creating some based off the standards that are in the field and then just operate off of them without them actually being official at your department?
Oh, Eric, come on. This one's good for you.
Come on, Eric.
Eric and I just recently went through this.
So I think that I'm going to give what I've come to call the standard fingerprint answer. It depends. Because everyone is in such different situations, right? If you're in a one-man shop and you're the only person there, well then yeah, it's easy to say, I'm going to start doing this and start following these standards that are now recommended either in the field in general or by a larger agency next door in my state, or some other group that you view as an authority here. But being a part of a major lab system where there's dozens of examiners in your unit across a multi-lab system, you can't just be like, all right, I'm doing it this way now. Screw you guys. This is the way it's going to go. So it's really dependent on the situation and on what is written down. And also, I think it depends on where you're at in this journey, right? If there's no SOPs and then you decide, okay, we're going to start heading this direction. Okay, look for some easy wins, right? Look for, all right, documentation. The first thing out of the gate, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be documenting basic stuff about each case. Then build up from there, because you can't just drop in and start from nothing into what the largest accredited labs in the country do. So it really does depend. But I think as long as you've recognized the issue and you're starting to move forward in that direction, you'll find opportunities for improvement. And you'll eventually start to get there, especially if you can demonstrate that these policies can be adopted without significantly affecting the backlog. You can still keep up on the work and say, hey, look, I'm doing all this stuff now, and I'm still up on top of things, or at least as up on top of things as I was before I started doing all this stuff. That's going to be able to give you some clout to be able to move forward and make them more official. It's going to, I think, vary so much depending on your situation.
Yeah, I take Eric's point and agree that, it really is going to depend on your situation. So I'm just going to offer the answer for the 3-person lab that's out there. So you got 2 examiners, in a section, and maybe a supervisor, and that supervisor is maybe a multi-sectional, multi-divisional, but you've got hopefully 2 examiners in this discipline, whether it's firearms or fingerprints or crime scene or whatever, digital evidence, whatever it might be. The answer, well, we don't have enough time to write these standards, or we can't, write these standards from scratch, is not a great answer, because there are enough laboratories out there that have their SOPs online, and whether or not they're OSAC best practices, whether or not they're SWIG documents that are available, and here's 2 that I can mention right now, the Virginia Department of Public Safety Forensic Science Lab or the Houston Forensic Science Center, both have their SOPs online. They're online and available, and anyone can go and download them.
Hundreds of pages.
Yes.
Of SOPs.
And like Eric said, you don't have to adopt them all, but there's no reason not to have whatever your comparison methodologies, the main ones. If you do chemical processing, you use amido black or phenolphthalein or whatever, there's no reason not to have an SOP for those. And I would much rather walk into the courtroom and say, yes, we have these SOPs. We're not accredited. And that's always my thing. That's because I'm not, I as a private examiner, not accredited. I explain in the courtroom, I'm not accredited. That does not mean I don't have quality assurance or follow procedures. Here are my written procedures. Here's my quality assurance. I'm not accredited. You can have these things. You can adopt these things. And while I can't say it wouldn't happen in all cases, I can't imagine a sergeant, lieutenant, captain, or whatever saying to you, well, you're not allowed to have written policies. Like, and if they say that, get that in writing, because I mean,
that sounds ludicrous to me.
Right. I mean, if you're willing to do this and it doesn't cost them any time or effort, and you're just adopting other people's stuff and just putting in your agencies, and it's really what you're doing. I mean, obviously, if that's what you're doing and you just have it written down now, really, it's not that much effort. Again, speaking from experience here, a single examiner in my agency, not accredited, but I have SOPs and quality assurance, and I have them and available. And when asked, I provide them.
And like you said, you don't have to change everything overnight. So start with someone that everyone on your team is agreeable to change, because that's something that I have experienced on a crime scene team where we had old school examiners. Those I'm not trying to stir up anything, but usually when people are like, I don't want SOPs, I'm against SOPs, it's because they're doing outdated practices and they don't want to change. So it did not work when we had a couple of people that wanted to change and implement some of these standards, even if we didn't have them written, because the other people weren't forced to and they didn't want to participate. So what we found was number one, our entire team started from scratch, brand new, and that helped. So we trained the trainees they didn't know anything different. We just trained them the way that we wanted to adopt the best practices. But if you don't have that luxury of having a brand new team from scratch, start with something that everyone is agreeable to change. I think that's going to be helpful. And then when you get over that little stepping stone and people are like, oh, that wasn't so bad, then you can keep adding on to it.
Yeah, I mean, again, you never take away. You're always adding to it. So start with the minimum, like you said, that everyone agrees on, and things that you need, like you should have an SOP for phenolphthalein. Should you get an immediate color change? Can you wait 30 seconds? Can you wait a minute? But by writing that down, you at least have this guidance in your SOP, so that when someone gets on the stand and said, well, I wait 5 minutes for a color change, that would be a problem. But if it's clear in the SOP and it's some basic things that everyone does and everyone's in agreement on, there are going to be some basic things that I think we can all get behind and go, it's what we're doing already. Why not write it down?
I love that when he said, do you wait 5 minutes? Eric immediately was like, oh.
Eric knows why.
We'll make sure to include his facial expression in the final episode.
He was immediately stressed.
No, there's just a reason why Glenn's new favorite word is phenolphthalein.
Oh no!
But
I have a case.
It's funny. I remember remember having a chemistry kit when I was like in 5th or 6th grade. That I'm like, wow, that's like the craziest looking word I've ever seen. Didn't realize that would follow me through my whole life.
For the rest of your career.
It's the first chemical you do titrations with.
I think Katie brought up a really good point. She said she's received pushback from management because when something's written, then it's harder to get them to do the things that they want you to do. And I think that is true as well. And that's hard because then I'm sure it's probably a sworn civilian dynamic. And it is true that, you know, as you start standardizing your procedures, you can fall back on like, well, I have to do this, instead of them being able to be like, well, this is what I want you to do in my scene. Then they wouldn't have that luxury anymore. But at the end of the day, you can bring them all of the case studies and the horror stories of bad practices in forensics. I mean, hell, they even have a Netflix series out, and you can explain to them like, this is what we're trying to avoid.
I mean, that's it. I mean, what I can do, right? I mean, and Katie wants to talk to me offline. I can give her example after example of laboratories that got shut down because it was exposed that they didn't have written procedures. And here in St. Paul, Minnesota, one of our laboratories was a drug chemistry lab. And the very first time that they had to start answering for their practices, not having SOPs, it turned out that they were doing absolutely batshit crazy things. And that came out on the stand during their testimony, to the point where they got shut down before the trial was even done. It was crazy.
Well, wasn't something like even using like the same syringes in different cases, or like
they were running drugs back to back without blanks between.
Yeah, no blanks in between the runs.
Yes.
Right. It was like holy. And sometimes it's the term, right? So sometimes management has a problem with the term, right? So they don't like SOPs. Okay, they're instructions, right? Or the notes to remind me what to do next, right? It's
procedure.
Find guidance. Something that they're okay with. That's you know, to write down, you know, where you're going to go. And I know it can be an uphill battle when you're getting that amount of pushback from management. But read up on the stories of, you know, Houston or St. Paul, or you know, some of the other labs that have been shut down. It's not management that gets fired. It's the examiners. It is the bottom line folks that get laid off. Always. It is never, oh, we're going to keep all these workers because they're just following, you know, what their management said. We're going to let the management go. Never happens. Not a single time.
Yep.
Oh my gosh. All right. So Jen is in here with us, and Jen posted a question earlier. She said, what are your feelings about limiting how many people a single person can train consecutively? Do you have any suggestions for helping to spread the responsibility around to multiple members of the unit instead of only relying on one person?
This is a great question. So I'm going to say one thing first. I know it's not her question, but I'm going to add this just so it's clear. One of the reasons I actually left the crime lab, I used to really like my job, but when I was done, I was supervising 24 people directly. And that is an insane number of people to be directly responsible for. And I see a trainer obviously being responsible for trainees. So I do see sometimes trainers, you know, once they say, hey, I'm going to be a trainer, they'll get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 trainees. And there's a certain load to this. So my first thought is like, there should definitely be a maximum of simultaneous trainees. And I think that it's really bad when you give all that to one person, because again, it becomes like supervising multiple people beyond what a normal person can handle. I, however, don't have a problem with consecutive training. And the reason I don't have a problem with that, like once you train one person, then you give the next person, because if you're really good at it and you have a passion for it and you have a system that's evidently working, then actually I really like the idea of a dedicated trainer. That person should be compensated for those extra responsibilities. And I think that should be very clear that this person is kind of being de facto declared the trainer. But if you work for an agency and you could work for me, Eric, or sorry, be trained by me, Eric, or Alice, and wouldn't you all want to be trained by Alice? I mean, wouldn't you rather Alice training you over and over and over and over besides grumpy old Glenn? Yeah, of course. So I don't have a problem with the consecutive as long as it's the right person in the right role. Now, if they've been voluntold to do this and they don't want to be a trainer, I think forcing someone to be a trainer when they're not good at it, that's a bad management decision. I get sometimes it's an emergency, like you got to have someone, we got to get through this. But there needs to be a long-term solution of who is this, or do we outsource this to people that really do enjoy this and are good at it and have a good system for it? So that's my thought.
Yeah, I think that, again, back to standard fingerprint answer, it depends. One of the things that really, really depends on is, are you being asked to still do active casework, or are you just the trainer? Because if you're still
another touchy topic.
Of course, doesn't everyone?
Absolutely. if you still have to put out 100% casework, well, I mean, one, I guess, would probably be the limit, because then it's almost impossible to do just that. But if that's it full time and you are doing 0 casework, then you can handle a few people at the same time. I think it depends a bit on the discipline of how many you can simultaneously handle, and also the trainer, right? That there's just, right, like Glenn said, there's a talent in this where, and I mean, just go to, you know, your kid's high school and look at the good teachers that can effectively communicate to a whole classroom of, you know, dumbass kids. And so again, that's another component, but also it can also start to expand and get larger as well if you can do something that I think is really important, and it's gaining the perspective of the entire unit, right? This really comes to be a benefit of larger agencies, right? In a larger agency, you don't have to be the best at everything. A well-rounded unit can have the APHIS guy and the processing guy and the photo guy all within the same group. And then you can, as a trainer, you can be like, okay, I can work APHIS, but I want you to spend a day or a week with the APHIS guy, right? And now you can cycle your trainees through that guy, and then you can handle more all at the same time, because you're not really doing everything. You're giving all the trainees perspective of all the best people in the different parts of your unit.
Yeah, I like that, Eric.
So first, would you find it surprising that we polled our audience and 70% of trainers do not get compensated for having trainees?
Not surprised. I wasn't when I was the trainer.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's not like monetarily compensated, then maybe compensated with like less responsibility of casework. I mean, there's other ways to compensate where, you know, you can do 30%
but that's
less,
not happening either. Let's be real.
Yeah.
All right. Well, really, then that, of course, harbors resentment of having to do this. And I think, as Matt said, the better you are at it, the more you get, and the more you are now relied upon to do this, do great work, receive more work. Yeah, this is now bad management, right? Because you're not finding incentive for your people, you know, to want to take on these additional tasks. And there are ways to do that within management's ability.
Agreed. And that's the unfortunate side of what we try to preach. I don't even we don't even teach it. We like try to preach it, that you cannot have a trainee and maintain your same caseload at the same time. We are firm believers that to the level of training that is required for most disciplines, I feel like maybe 2 trainees max is really what you should have in order to maintain your effectiveness. And also I know this is kind of like a little side tangent to Jen, but this is just based off of my personal experience. I would kind of wonder, because she said consecutive, so like not simultaneous trainees, but consecutive trainees. I would also wonder the culture in the unit, like why is your unit a revolving door? Because that's a whole other thing to unpack, where like you have trainers that get into this and they love training, but eventually the wear and tear of like, why are you constantly training? There are units out there that someone actually at the symposium is like, well, it's been 5 years since we had a trainee. So those units exist,
But the reason why your agency is a revolving door is also kind of a concern.
So that's a really good point, and a really good example that comes to mind besides my agency, but one I think other people can appreciate is the FBI. So if anyone knows the federal system really well, I mean, the FBI would hire all these great people. They'd hire some of the best of the best of the best and the brightest of the brightest. They would train them, and as soon as they were done training, they would immediately leave to go to another federal agency. And everyone knew this. I mean, and it still happens, maybe not as much as it happened a few years ago, but it was one of those, like, you now have to look at yourself. Is it the money? Well, no. I mean, they're going for the same. I mean, because in the federal system, it's like the same pay grades. They're not even changing pay grades. So what is it about your agency that is causing this? Everyone wants to go there, they get trained and go somewhere else. This is now, as you're pointing out, Ashley, this is something more systemic within the agency.
100% burnout, which I do think, like Glenn and Eric talked about, you can love training and be wonderful at training and be given the tools to be a good trainer, you know, have some of your caseload taken away. But if you do it again and again and again and again and again, you may eventually lead to burnout. And then really you have to be an advocate for yourself and be like, I'm not doing as good of a job at this as I once did because you've burnt out my passion for it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Because you'll never see the fruits of your labor. I mean, you never get to see your kid grow up. It's just constantly surrogate birthing them to go somewhere else.
Just to go somewhere else, right?
Right.
That's a new term.
Ruining your body in the process.
Call it surrogate agencies.
Ruining your body in the process. Dying. All right, we have another question here from Haley with her picture here with the beautiful red hair. So Haley is going from a department where essentially she was the supervisor. She was not the formal supervisor, but you know, she was the supervisor. And now she's starting in a new agency and she's going back to being a trainee. And so she's asking if we have any suggestions from her transitioning from that kind of leadership role where she was kind of in charge of all the things, making her own decisions, to now where she's going to be the new infant at her new department, starting all over.
Just make it a rule first day, make it a rule that you never say at my old agency, right? If it's going to be helpful, they might ask, and then share your experience as an answer to their question. But just sit there silently, right? Listen, ask questions, but in a way that doesn't like question the rightness or wrongness of the policy, but the reasoning behind it, right? Like what happened here, you know, in the past that led you guys to setting up your policy this way. Lots of listening, because you can't, especially if you were, you know, in that type of position previously, you know, you're not going to stay at the bottom forever, and you'll have opportunities to suggest changes down the road. But, you know, going in, I'd say just do a lot of listening and understanding. As an example, you know, when I worked for Arizona, I was trainer for a little while, and I was involved in writing policies for parts of it. And then when I left and went to Ideal Innovations, it's a completely different environment, being a contract lab versus a state lab. But the amount to learn of all the so very different ways that they operated because of their mission, that's all I could do was to keep up, was just listen. And granted, I wasn't there long enough to then move on and institute suggestions for further improvements, but that'll come. And I think it requires an epic level of patience to get past that first stage to then understanding where your new agency is at.
Love that. Good tips. It's hard. It's hard to go all the way back and then just bite your tongue while you're learning all of the new things. But I think if you really can just absorb, like Eric said, you'll be able to fill in. There'll be a lot of things that are different between the two departments, So it'll be easy for you to kind of fill in all of those gaps in knowledge of, you know, how they do their documentation versus how you used to do your documentation, their processes versus your old processes and all of that. And it'll, you know, it'll make people very excited to have you there to see that you're so engaged in your learning process.
I would also say, like, have a voice as far as, like, don't let them rush you through a training program or, like, completely eliminate a training program just because you have prior experience. You need that knowledge. You need that understanding, like Eric was saying. You need to be able to ask why. You need to be shown things because your skills are not transferable from one agency to another. So just, you know, make sure that they're not just trying to plop you into casework too quickly. You do need to take time and slow down and make sure that you understand everything that they do at that agency and how they do it.
That's such a great nugget. Ashley and I have both been through that, where we have gone to a department, been hired for a role, been hired for supervisor roles, actually, where nobody tested our skills. Nobody checked that we knew what we were talking about. And they just plopped us in there like, okay, you run the crime scene unit now. Never checked that I could do crime scene work, any of that stuff. Same thing with latents. I've been hired as a certified latent examiner at departments where they've plopped me right into casework and never checked that I knew anything about latents. Wow. And
even if it's a supervisor, she said it's a supervisor to a supervisor position. If whatever types of positions you are supervising, have training from that agency in that thing. Yeah. There are going to be some supervisory things that you need to understand, but you also need to understand what your people are doing and why they're doing it. So you need to still be that, you know, go in the technician role, go roll through that training program, even though you are plopped into a supervisory role. That stuff is important. Do not rush it. And if you are in charge of, and Erin can tell her experience with this, but if you are in any part in charge of the evidence, you better do 100% inventory.
Good Lord. So my poor evidence unit. Yeah. For sure. That was one of the first things that I demanded when I got the evidence unit was we're going to do a 100% inventory. And it turned out they hadn't done one in 17 years. And so I don't know if you're getting that unit, but I would highly recommend you do a 100% inventory of all of the items. But regardless, I mean, you're going to have to learn all these things either way. If you take the time to learn them in the beginning, it's just going to speed up the whole process for you. You know, Ashley and I don't know if Glenn or Eric have experienced this, but we had to take so much longer to learn how to do everything because we had to learn it on our own. We had to fumble through everything till we figured it all out. So literally fumbled through all of it. Yeah. Till we figured it out. So taking the time to train in the beginning will speed up your acclimation to that new department a lot. It'll make it a lot faster. Let's see. Someone else had a good question in here. Why do we not see lifers at agencies anymore? 3 to 4 year time frame, and then we move on.
Yeah, my agency was exactly one of those. When I joined it in 2000, it was maybe 50 people in the entire lab. And almost everybody, once they got in that lab, they retired from that lab. They hit their 30 year, and then they retired. One of the biggest reasons, though, was they had an amazing retirement program. They were under like a state patrol retirement program. They would retire with 100% of their salary, basically. Wow. And the benefits were amazing. You know, the full medical and everything. Even at 55, they were retiring. And I've watched over the years that agency that I started at, I watched how like that got whittled away because that got sealed off. They had a strike in the 70s and they got sealed off, and then they got a different union plan and a different pension plan. And I watched how that got carved up over the years. And other than maybe law enforcement that might have their police pensions and such, which very different than I think civilian, there isn't that. I think you don't have that golden pot at the end of the road. I think that you also have, with a lot of civilians, more education these days. So they're trying to, of course, work up faster the ladder. And that can be a really slow process in a lot of crime labs because there are too few supervisory positions. So I think they want a little more, a little faster. And it's just easier to go somewhere else put 3-4 years in here, go to another one, put 5-6 years there, and just keep switching and trying to move up the ladder in other agencies than your own agency. And then on top of that, someone with the millennial thing. I mean, I'm not a millennial, but I mean, I did see that with some of our younger hires. They had just unrealistic expectations about how much money they should be making in X number of years. And I don't think that fits with government work. That fits with private industry just fine, but you don't have job security in private industry. So yeah, feel free to go make 3 times as much for that degree in private industry, but don't be surprised if you're out of job in 6 or 7 years when they downsize. You'll never get to that pension part of it. So I think it's a very complicated thing, but I feel like the systems today just allow for promoting up in other agencies than within your own agency. That's my observation.
Yeah, I completely agree about the benefits package part, right? If there's not a reason to, if the agency doesn't provide a reason to stay, why should they expect people to stay?
Right.
I mean, creating this kind of ecosystem. I didn't get in, my first forensic job until I was 29. So I tried for a number of years to get hired on, and basically everywhere I went required at least 2 years experience. I need 2 years experience. In 2 years experience. Well, I eventually got hired on by the only agency that didn't require 2 years of experience.
And then as soon as you got it, you went somewhere else.
Well, I'm like, well, it totally makes sense. And going along with a previous story Glenn had told, it was not requiring 2 years of experience and also finding someone willing to go to the part of the state that no one else wanted to go to. That's how I got hired. Once you then have that experience, I mean, typically the agency that requires 0 years of experience also pays less. So now that you meet those requirements, might as well go to a different agency where the pay is better, or the benefits are better, or there's some sort of incentive to go there. And those agencies have basically been able to kind of opt out of dealing with training people from scratch, just training people on our policies and not how to do the basics of the job, because they can just pay a little bit more and then steal folks over from the lab that's sitting on the bottom rung of the ladder. I think it just makes complete sense.
Yeah.
It would be surprising if it worked any other way.
Yeah.
Given
and I agree with Haley's comment here too. I really like this one. I think the new generations are also less likely to take some of the BS that others may have had. My department turns toxic, hence a new job. I think that's very true. I think when I first started, I saw people put up with bad bosses for 10 to 15 years because that's just what that generation did. You got a bad boss, it sucked, but work wasn't supposed to be fun. Work was work. You go to work and work ends, and that's work. When I was in there was this sort of kind of middle ground. And then when I saw this newer generation coming in, yeah, they felt like they had disagreements with their boss within 2-3 years, they were out of there. There was just no sense of why should I put up with this for the next 10 years of my life. I can appreciate that. It's just a different value system, and that they're looking for work that is not toxic and makes them happy. Imagine that. I don't disagree with that approach.
Aaron and I talk about this a lot too. We are millennials, but just because I've had family generation after generation with government jobs, and that was the thing to do. You go to school, you get a government job, and you're living the dream, right?
Right. But
now, that's not even barely livable.
Yeah.
And you probably have student debt and all that stuff. And I really think the writing is on the wall. Like you said, the benefit packages back then were very enticing. You would put up with a lot of BS to, see the light at the end of the tunnel. I really think for our generation, I don't know. I'm not very confident that we're going to be able to retire. Yeah. So if I'm going to be working my entire life, I might as well enjoy it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a very good point.
Yeah, retiring with 100% of your pay with 100% of your insurance, that's an incredible incentive to stay at a department. It just doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't. It really doesn't.
And it makes sense that the millennial generation would be the one where this is happening when they did what they were supposed to and went to college, and all of a sudden, hey, guess what? The economy tanked and you guys are screwed. That's just teaching that whole group from a very young age, working age, of a different set of values, like Glenn was saying.
Absolutely.
Right.
All right. Well, I think we went through all the questions that were posted. We went through the questions you guys have dropped in the chat. Does anybody else have any other burning questions? Oh,
I have one thing to say before we go.
Okay.
Eric touched on it a little bit, and I'm going to really emphasize this because it's something that I am seeing so much right now. We talked about SOPs, we talked about procedures, we talked about this, boss doesn't like this, boss isn't going to have that. The one thing that I think everyone here can control, you are in control of this, and it is case documentation. The number one thing that I am seeing over and over and over in cases where I'm sitting there in trial and listening to people testify or reading transcripts or consulting with the attorneys, defense or prosecutors, the number one problem we are seeing around the country is lack of documentation. And even if your agency will not allow for SOTs, you're never going to get accredited. They're never going to support any kind of certification for you. Any of those things, you still usually can control documentation. You can control how much you document in a case. Because even if your boss doesn't like it, they go, well, that's fine. I'm just doing it for me. You don't have to do it. I'm doing it for me. If your boss comes to you and says, stop documenting, you're not allowed to document in this case, get that in writing. That's going to come back to haunt somebody. And it shouldn't be you that should come back to. Because just very quickly, Eric and I, we just did like a multi-episode podcast episode on this big case in Texas and a report that came out. Number one issue, lack of documentation. And what we're seeing now is certain states have what's called the changed science, like a change in science writ, WRIT, which means that cases are being reevaluated, not on the standards at the time, but by today's standards. And this is allowing in 8 states, and more states coming, the ability to take cases, review them, and possibly get a new trial or at least a new review by judges on today's science, what we know about today. And when we're going back to those cases and we're seeing lack of documentation as being the issue, not errors or mistakes, but simply lack of documentation is causing massive problems. So Eric and I just had a case we just talked about with this very thing. It's podcast episodes coming on another few weeks probably. I have a case, or had a case a couple weeks ago in South Dakota, which was another big issue. It was a DNA analyst who had swabbed various areas on evidence, did not document clearly where those swabs came from. Massive issue in the case, massive problems. The guy got acquitted, and he might have been guilty, but because of all of these issues that came up, the defense was able to point out lack of documentation. She caused some of her own problems on the stand, but it all came down to lack of documentation. And I'm dealing with a case in California right now where the crime scene investigator, she did a good job of photographing. She took hundreds of photographs of the scene, good distance shots, staying 10 to 20 feet away from everything, lots of little placards marking everything, but no close-ups of any of the bloodstains, no close-ups or rulers of anything. Just kind of it was a long scene, but not detailed enough, coming back to haunt in this case, because now important questions can't be answered. It's the number one thing that you can control. I beg of you out there, even if you don't have SOPs, you have no intention of getting accredited, start thinking about documentation. If anybody told you in your training that documenting less is better, that document less because you don't want to give ammunition to defense to shoot you on the stand, that is bad advice. And what you're really doing is committing suicide in front of defense on the stand. That is what you're doing, because having poor documentation is really stinking these cases. And I cannot tell you how many times it's coming up in just the last couple of months. It's my big theme. So please, please, please consider having better documentation.
I love that. Definitely make sure you guys check out that episode. And I think this is a really good lesson to learn, and you can apply it in several different things. So I do love the training symposium. I love our training courses and stuff like that. But another common theme kind of going along this line is control what you can control. So I know all of us like to, shoot the shit about my boss does this, my management does that, I have a shitty trainee, but you can control your reaction to it. And like you said, even if you have poor practices at your agency, control what you can control. And documentation is absolutely something that is within your power.
Yes. Yes. It's my number one thing. So the number one way I see cases either going down, losing cases, getting overturned, having problems is lack of documentation.
Yeah, if you find yourself on the stand saying, well, I would have swabbed it here, red flag. You should have
I probably would have swabbed it here. Eric read the transcripts in this case, so he knows how much this is on my brain.
Oh gosh, that's pretty bad. From just personal experience,
years and years ago, we didn't have, at my old agency, we didn't have specific policies requiring the documentation of which features you relied on to make your decision, right? The specific minutia. So I decided, you know what? After some training classes, hearing it emphasized, I'm going to start doing this. I have a way to do it, which I was lucky to have a method to do it and have that be saved with the case. That's a big first step. I'm going to start doing this. And then expanded I'm going to save both the analysis and the side-by-side comparison, not just the end side-by-side. No policies telling me I had to. I just decided I'm going to start doing this. And that not only, I think, gave better product to the work I was doing, but also served to demonstrate that it was possible so that other people could too. And that eventually, once everyone's doing something, might as well write down as the policy too. So it is a method of change, of deciding to do that documentation. It's even if you're not in charge of whatever, it can help affect change later on down the road.
Yes, which only serves to protect you and the case, the evidence. I mean, it's self-serving.
Yeah, it's better than having Glenn show up and start asking or telling the attorney, ask him these questions.
I've told Glenn that before. I'm like, I'll die. I literally die if they're like, the defense hired Glenn. I'm like, great, that's it. I'm over it. I can't do it.
Well,
but Glenn, I will tell you, I have thorough documentation, Glenn.
In this recent case, the fingerprint examiner was great. Fingerprint examiner she testified fantastic. It was the biologist that, if that case was lost because of forensic evidence, it was because of her testimony, lack of documentation, and then being immediately certain on the stand about what she did 3 years ago when she wasn't certain before.
Yeah, that's a problem.
That's what it came down to. The fingerprint examiner testified with humility and said, I don't know, or I didn't document that. I probably should have documented that. She was very good. It was the biologist that was the problem.
Oh, gosh. All right, guys, you heard it. You heard it here. Write down all the things.
All the things.
This was really fun. We had some good convos here.
Yeah, that was fun. A lot of fun. Thanks for inviting us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, we always enjoy chatting with you guys. Getting down and dirty into some of these risque topics is always fun.
Agreed. It's great. Agreed. This whole program you guys have put together is really
with a drink in hand, no less.
Well, one of us has a drink in hand.
I'll make up for it later.
I wish I had one.
I got a late night ahead of me.
I have coffee.
I so wish that this program like this had been around, 10 years ago. It's really impressive, and it's great to see such a response from our community.
Yep, indeed. good luck to the rest of the conference. And it sounds like you have a great program, and makes me wish that I was still a supervisor, but not that much.
Only a little bit.
Just a little bit. Like Eric, I wish this training was available when I was a supervisor with my 23 people.
That's kind of the goal, is to help the people help the people that are out there now, so they don't have to have the struggles that we had. Yeah. So we're excited to have all these trainers with us here this week. We hope you guys are really enjoying the symposium for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. Nice job, guys. Well done. Bye now. Good night.
Bye, guys. Good night.
Night, everyone.
Thank you so much for being here and listening to Forensics Unfiltered. If you liked this episode, would you do us a favor and leave a review letting us know specifically what you liked about this topic? It will only take a minute, but it will really help us plan future episodes so we can bring you more topics that you want to listen to. We'll be sure to provide any links from today's episode in our show notes on our website. Head to www.gapscience.com. Until next time, stay safe out there.